Every light casts a shadow, and every shadow hides a story. The kind of story that crawls under your skin and stays there long after you stop listening. These aren't just tales of ghosts or monsters. They read the things people actually lived through and never forgot. Welcome to the dark side of reality, where fear isn't imagined. It's remembered. I wasn't looking for trouble. It was a late August weekend, and three of us from work had gone out to the old service roads behind the industrial park. We'd all grown up in the area and knew the stories: an abandoned maintenance compound, a few rusting trailers, a lot of cracked concrete and chain link fence. Nothing cinematic, not a haunted mansion or a lost asylum, just worn out, fenced off land that dared college kids and bored 20-somethings to cross the barrier and take pictures. We parked on the side of the paved road where the lamps had given up long ago. The air was humid and still. The only sound was the distant drone of a highway and the occasional clink of metal when the wind found something loose. We grabbed flashlights more out of habit than necessity. My friend Mark brought his old DSLR and insisted on trying some long exposure shots. I remember thinking his camera looked too professional for a place that smelled like oil and mildew, like lungs that had slowly forgotten how to breathe. We slipped through a gap in the fence where someone had folded the wire back into itself. The opening was barely big enough, and for a moment the three of us crouched there like burglars, watching the property through the slit. There were shed roofs and a low building half swallowed by kudzu. A yellow caution sign leaned against a concrete block: nitrogen monoxide trespassing, private property. It had been bleached by sun and rain until it read more like a suggestion than a threat. At first, it was typical trespassing fun, joking, pushing each other toward an old trailer, making stupid faces for pictures. The flashlight beams crossed the same places again and again, folding light over rust and broken glass. The camera clicks were small, sharp notes in the air. We were three grown idiots treating an empty place like an adventure. The routine comfort of that made the place feel less empty, like our presence filled the rooms with meaning again. We found a small maintenance shed with a door off its hinges. Inside were rows of lockers, a bench, and a wall clock that had stopped at 10:17. There was an old kettle on a hot plate, a scattering of cigarette packs, an industrial mop bucket with a long wooden handle. Someone had left a thermos on top of a locker, its lid dented. The air had that mix of dust and old coffee that only comes from places people used to occupy for short, labored stretches, places that see lots of hands at odd hours and then get abandoned. Mark was taking a panorama when he froze and lowered the camera. He said quietly, "Did you hear that?" For a second, the three of us strained into the darkness, listening. There was nothing, or rather, there was the same low, constant hum of insects and distant traffic. But then, a few yards away, something shifted. The soft creak of a wooden pallet settling, or the shifting of someone putting weight on rotted boards. It was small, so small I wanted to laugh it off. We walked toward the sound. The light from our flashlights slid across debris and came to rest on a second trailer half buried in weeds, its side paneling swollen from rain. The door hung open like an absent jaw. Mark motioned for us to split. He'd check around the trailer, and we would take the shed. We were three idiots again, but in different positions now. I remember thinking how stupid the plan was, how in an hour we'd be back on the highway swapping fast food wrappers, and this would be some silly anecdote. You don't reason very deeply when you re-keeping up a game narrative in your head. The inside of the trailer smelled like damp cardboard, something else faint under it, sweet and metallic, like pennies. There were hand-drawn notes taped to the wall, grocery lists with items crossed out, a child's crayon drawing stuck to a dented filing cabinet with a magnet. That small domesticity in the middle of the industrial decay made me pause. These were the details that make you humanize a place, that make you imagine the real lives that squeeze through it before abandonment. I reached out to touch the drawing, fingers brushing the waxy lines, and something about the way the magnet hung told me we weren't as alone as we'd assumed. Mark called my name in a voice that had the wrong tone. too sharp and too careful. When I stepped out, he was standing at the back of the trailer, flashlight angled at the ground. His beam found a set of footprints in the dust, one pair, bare, leading away and then disappearing under the weeds. They were fresh enough that the edges hadn't been feathered by wind. Close by, pressed into the soft soil, were the faint marks of a cartwheel. Someone had been here recently. My throat closed around the noise a breath makes when something unexpected sits on your chest. We started calling out, stupidly polite. "Hello? Hey, anyone there?" The sound of our voices seemed intrusive, like yelling in a library. A shutter banged in the distance, as if something had answered. We told ourselves to keep moving, to check the perimeter and find whoever had been living or hiding or whatever it was. That's when things began to skew. Outside, down a narrow path between trailers, we found a little campsite, a folding chair sunk into the dirt, a small electric lantern, a plastic crate used for makeshift furniture. There were 3 empty soda cans arranged in a precise triangle on top of the crate. On closer inspection, the cans had fingerprints on them, and one of the fingerprints had a smudge of something darker near the edge. Not blood, at least I told myself that then, but enough to suggest someone had been here in a hurry. We moved slower after that. Footsteps that had seemed decisive now sounded tentative, like the same movement but uncertain about the direction. We found other signs, cigarette butts pressed into the seams of tire treads, a scarf snagged on a fence post, an old jacket draped over a pallet. Everything suggested habitation without naming a person. It was like reading someone's thought without their voice. The dawning, quietly horrible realization came with the sounds. Not big noises, no shouting, no engines. Just tiny, deliberate interruptions in the air. A floorboard sighing under weight when there shouldn't be anyone on it. The faint tap of something against metal, like a coin or a ring, then silence. Twice we heard breathing that wasn't ours. Close, shallow, and timed like someone trying not to be heard. The second time I felt the breath on my skin, as if a stranger had blown across my wrist. I remember pulling my arm back like I'd been burned. We decided to leave. It felt like the adult sensible choice. Mark packed his camera carefully, and we moved with that small efficiency people take on when they want to stop being brave. We headed back the way we had come and found the gap in the fence. Blocked. Someone had woven chicken wire through the opening and zipped it in place with those plastic ties you see on appliances. It was done clumsily, but it was done to keep people from leaving, or perhaps to keep people from entering. For a few moments, the 3 of us stood there, under the yellow light of a street lamp that flickered like an eye, trying to decide which. We tried the other exit. The path that had been open to the road was tangled with brush and an overturned trash bin. It was slow going, and when we finally broke out into the shoulder of the road, we were winded in a way that felt like more than physical exertion. We sat in the car for a minute and didn't speak. The radio hung static that seemed too loud for a late summer night. On the drive back, we tried to laugh. We pointed out how silly we'd been, how many horror movies we'd just lived through. It was a thin thing. When I got home, I went through my photos. Mark had shot a dozen images, long exposures of rusted machinery, and one blurry rectilinear frame that I couldn't immediately place. When I zoomed in, it resolved into a shape standing at the edge of the trailer lot. A shadowed figure, turned slightly away, shoulders narrow. The figure's head was tilted like it was listening. What made me stop breathing was a second figure behind the first, half hidden, crouched like someone waiting for a cue. I woke up that night at 2:17. The house had the filtered silence of late hours, city hum softened by distance. I couldn't get the breathing sound out of my head. I told myself it was nothing, the heater, the neighbor's dog, but the space under my skin pulsed as if trying to tell me something. 2 days later, Mark called and asked if I wanted to go back. He insisted we had left the place in a mess and wanted to take more photos. I said no. He said it was fine. He'd go alone. He seemed restless on the phone, and the part of me that was bravely curious about the human condition wanted to see him prove there was nothing there. He didn't come back. They found Mark 3 days later in a motel room 2 towns over. He'd checked in under his real name and paid cash. There were cheap beers in the trash, a microphone headset on the desk, and his camera bag on the chair. The camera was out on the bed with its lens cap off. The police called it an accidental overdose. His phone had a few strange messages from unknown numbers. Short, blank voice notes that, when played, were the static of background, a low hum, and occasional pinprick noises that could have been people moving around in the dark. There was also one photo file that the investigators said had corrupted metadata. It was the same kind of blurry silhouette from the trailer, only closer. The figure's head was turned more, and if you leaned in, you could swear you saw the suggestion of a face in the dark. Not human, not animal, only the suggestion of something that had learned posture and breath. They told us to let it go. They told Mark's parents the usual things people say when they don't have answers. The lot behind the industrial park was locked down the next week as the company that owned it did an inventory. But the locks were cheap, and the wind will always find a way through a fenced place, and curiosity is cheaper than caution. Sometimes in the months that followed, I'd drive past that stretch of road. I learned to watch for the broken fence and the yellowing sign. There were nights I'd park a block away and sit in the car with the engine off. Once I thought I saw a light move among the trailers, tiny, consistent, as if someone had set a lantern near the ground and was sweeping it slowly. I told myself it was an old security light on a motion sensor. Another night, standing with a cigarette, I'd already convinced myself to quit. Something brushed along the other side of the lot's fence. It wasn't a run, not the kind you do when startled. It was a measured, deliberate touch along the metal, like a cat tracing the top of a fence, long and slow and caring. It stopped at a point directly opposite where we had crept in months ago. The worst part, maybe, is how ordinary it is. No red-eyed monster perched in silhouette. No thunderclap explodes the scene. Just a series of small betrayals, a footprint where you expected none, the quiet exhale of breath, not your own, a figure holding still in the corner of an image. It's the kind of thing that settles into your life and waits. I don't know who or what lives there. I don't know whether Mark was looking for something and found it, or whether something found him because we had been loud and foolish and present. Sometimes I imagine a person who used to live in those trailers, who never left, who adapted to the rust and learned the rhythm of the place. Sometimes I imagine there's nothing that would map onto human thinking at all, only an impulse, to occupy space that people call home because that's how it understands being there. Every so often my phone lights up with a number I don't recognize, I don't answer. Once, when I let it ring until it stopped, a single short breathing sound was on the other end. Close, restrained, like the same breath I felt on my wrist that night. Nobody spoke. There was no signal, no message left, just that sound and then silence. I try to tell myself stories that end in answers. I try to picture a reason that would sit neat and tidy under the weight of logic. But the truth sits in the small details. The stopped clock, the child's drawing, the soda cans arranged like a punctuation mark, the way a fence can be closed to stop someone leaving the way a breath can mean either life or the absence of it. I stopped driving past the industrial park as often. I also never deleted Mark's photos. Sometimes late, when I can't sleep, I open them and scroll until the picture of the trailer pulls my attention. If I zoom and hold my breath and tilt my head, there's a moment where the grain blurs into shapes that could be people. And something about the angle makes their posture look almost like waiting. Not threatening, not hunting, just attentively present, like someone who has been there long enough to know what we do when we come into their rooms. I don't go back. I don't know if I should. Sometimes I think it's only a matter of time until I see a car parked outside that has been there for days. Someone's flashlight beam making slow, patient circles among the trailers. Sometimes I imagine standing at the fence and being asked, not with words, but with an expectant tilt of something in shadow, to step inside and stay a while. I don't have an answer for you. If there's a moral, it's only this. The places we think of as empty are rarely empty. They keep what we forget. They script the small noises and the neglected drawings so that someday when someone young and curious comes through, they'll find a life paused with its eyes open. Sometimes I still think I hear Mark's voice. Not from a phone, not from a file, but an echoed cadence of our old jokes. muffled and patient, as if coming from behind a closed door you forgot was being watched. The last time my phone rang with that breathing sound, I let it go to voicemail. It stayed on my screen for 3 days, then disappeared without a trace. No file, no log, nothing in the records. If you ever find a place that looks abandoned and it seems to have the soft domestic marks of someone who used to live there, a child scribble, a thermos left on a locker, remember that these are not just tokens, they are anchors. They say, "We have been here." They say, "We are waiting." And if you come across the careful, light touch of a hand along a fence at midnight, feel it closely, move away quietly, and don't call back. Sometimes silence is the only thing left to respect. This happened to me when I was 22. I was freelancing then, drifting between odd jobs and late-night shifts, sleeping on a futon in a cheap apartment above a laundromat. I filled my nights the same way a lot of people do when they re-young and restless, walking, exploring, looking for things to feel something about. It was an abandoned house 2 blocks from where I lived, a squat 2-story thing with a sagging porch and boarded windows. Kids in the neighborhood used to dare each other to go up to it. Nobody ever stayed long. I didn't go for the dare. I went because it felt like a place that would have secrets, the kind of place that stores ordinary, neglected life like dust. It was late November. The air had that thin cold that makes the skin on your hands ache. I remember the way the streetlight in front of the house threw the pale outline of the porch. Onto the wet pavement, how the wind lifted the loose board on the second step and let it fall with a small dry sound. I stood for a long moment and watched that board fall twice before I pushed my way through the gap in the rotted railing and onto the porch. The wood groaned the whole time, a low complaining sound, like something waking up. The front door wasn't locked. I didn't expect it to be. Inside, everything was slow. The air tasted of old paper and soap, and there was the faint copper smell of rust under it. Light from the street filtered through cracks in the boards, striping the hallway in pale bars. A staircase rose on my left, carpet long gone, tacks like teeth in the stringer. The house smelled like times of day that weren't mine supper that had cooled hours ago. A clock that had stopped in the afternoon, a radio long out of batteries. There was a stillness that seemed stitched into the rooms. I moved through quietly. My steps were careful, not because I thought anyone would hear me, but because anything loud felt wrong. I kept expecting the creak of a floorboard to bloom into an acknowledgement, someone clearing their throat, a voice saying, "What are you doing here?" But there was nothing. Instead, there were small, ordinary things that became loud by context. A loose shutter tapping once against the window frame, a single glass in the sink that chimed as I crossed the kitchen, the long fin, afraid of a pipe somewhere in the walls when I stood still. The house reacted to me like an animal testing a stranger. On the second floor, the rooms were divided by doors that hung open at odd angles. One room was full of boxes flattened into each other, labels faded. Another was a child's room. One corner still had a plastic dinosaur, its color bleached by the sun. On the far side was what looked like a bedroom. A mattress sagged on a metal frame, sheet tucked in at one side, the whole thing impossibly neat. On the small nightstand lay a framed photograph, face down. I reached for it because there is always that human impulse to see who lived in a place, to fold their life into your memory for a moment. When I turned the frame, the picture showed a woman in her 30s, smiling, at a summer barbecue. There was a half-filled cup in her hand, and I could see clearly, so clearly it made the room feel closer, that she had an old watch on her wrist, a metal band, scratched. For a second, I felt like I had stepped into someone's paused life, like I could pick up that plastic dinosaur and place it on a shelf and nothing would change. Except now, I would have rearranged someone else as silence. I left the frame face up and moved on. It was when I stood in the doorway to the hallway that I noticed them, footprints. Not muddy, not fresh with the crispness of a trail, but faint impressions pressed into the dust along the middle of the hall. They were bare, as if someone had paced the length in socked feet. The heels sunk slightly deeper. They were not mine. My boots had left a different tread downstairs, but they headed away from the stairs toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen. On instinct, one followed. The kitchen door was half closed. The only light came in a single long beam from a gap in the boards over the sink. It made a band of light on the linoleum, and there, crossing it, were more prints. They stopped at the sink. There was no other movement, no smell other than the old soap. I stood there a long time with my hands in my pockets, listening to the house breathe. I told myself someone else had been here earlier that night, someone who maybe lived nearby and came in for warmth. It was possible. People used abandoned places for shelter sometimes. I decided to go down to the street and sit on the curb for a while. Maybe the place would seem less charged if I didn't stay inside it. Outside again, the porch board creaked the same note when I put my weight on it. And as I walked away, when I walked back, lanterning the path from the streetlight, the front door was open farther than I'd left it. The hall smelled the same. The footprints were closer to the base of the stairs this time, like someone had circled back. I told myself it was wind, that the open door had allowed drafts to move things. I told myself a lot of things, but there was a set of noises that I couldn't explain away. From somewhere upstairs, a soft sniffing sound like someone breathing through the nose with the kind of quiet you only hear when you re-holding your breath, and the faint scrape of fingernails against something wooden. I climbed the stairs slowly, each tread responding with a small personal groan. At the top, in the landing's dimness, there was a new thing I hadn't noticed before. Tiny, neat lines on the banister, narrow as if the edge had been scored with something sharp. They were not deep. They could have been from a dozen ordinary causes moving furniture. A pet's claws, but they were placed at eye level, spaced almost like tally marks. I pressed my thumb to one of them and felt the dried residue of something flaky. I didn't want to analyze it. I wanted simply to move. The bedroom was, as I'd left it, only colder. I stood there for a long time, feeling the house close in, like hands settling on shoulders. At some point I sat on the edge of the mattress. The frame photo stared at me from the knit stand. The smile looked smaller in the dim light. On impulse, I checked the watch she wore. It was a small detail. It didn't tick. I heard a faint sound and like a shoe being slid across the linoleum from across the room. I turned and saw the faintest shadow move just outside the doorway. I froze. The shadow was too slender to be a person. It could have been a trick of light. I held my breath and waited. The house answered with the kind of silence that feels full, not empty, but full of little things waiting. I told myself to leave, to step down and close the door behind me and put whatever I'd seen into a folder labeled imagination. I stood, took one step, and the hair at the back of my neck prickled again. There was a soft knock on the bedroom window. Not a loud pounding, not a demanding rapping. A single, quiet knock, like a fingernail testing glass. I had the absurd thought that someone outside was trying to be careful so they wouldn't wake whoever had once lived here. I moved to the window and the knock came again from the other side, only softer. The glass was cold under my palm. I stood with my face close to it and tried to look out. The yard was dark. The moon was a thin half-stripe. Something shifted behind the branches of the walnut tree, and the shadows hummed. I stepped back, and the knock came a third time, this time from inside the room, from the closet door. We don't ever expect the world to fold in on the ordinary like that. The knock was a small thing. It was, in a way, the most ordinary possible sound, but coming from an impossible place, it was impossible to ignore. My mind leaped for explanations and found none that felt solid. A rodent? A tree branch? A trick of settling wood? I opened the closet without looking at the floor. There was nothing but a moth-eaten coat and an empty shelf and the faint outline of where hangers had been. When I closed the door, there were prints on the inside of the closet door at chest height. Not scuffed like someone had pushed it, but darker lines pressed into the film of dust too thin ovals, like a face had been pressed to the wood. They weren't mine. I knew that the moment I saw them because they were not paired like hands, not steady like fingerprints. They were blurred, as if something had been held there and then rapidly removed. For the first time my pulse jumped my ears. I left the house without thinking now, because there's a particular kind of fear that makes your feet move faster than your head. The next morning, I convinced myself I hadn't actually been inside, that my memory had folded in on itself. that I had imagined details in the dark. I went back at noon in daylight, telling myself I'd prove nothing was there. The porch was lit with honest sun. Inside, everything looked like an ordinary abandoned house again. No new prints on the hallway, no lines on the banister. The mattress sagged the same way. The photograph was face up, the woman smiling at a barbecue in a summer that had nothing to do with me. When I turned to leave, I saw on the kitchen counter a note folded in half. I didn't take it at first. It could have been left by someone cleaning the place, a list, a mislaid grocery note. Eventually, I smoothed it open with 2 fingers. The words were written in a neat, small hand. We should not be here. I don't know who we referred to. For a moment, I thought of myself how often I said when telling another person about a place, as if to pull them into the scene. I folded the note back and left it on the counter. On my way out, I noticed a small smear on the outside of the back door, near the handle. In daylight, it looked like the dull imprint of a palm, the fingers splayed, pressed with enough force to smudge the dust beneath. I touched it. Cold had set in from outside. There was something dry in the smear, something that crumbled under my nail. That night he dreamt of the house. I dreamed of the photograph turned toward me, its smile gone slack, and of a shadow pressing its face to a pane of glass. I woke with the taste of dust in my mouth and the certainty that I had been watched. Weeks later, I stopped going. Life moved on: work, rent, a friend's party I couldn't get out of. But sometimes, when I walked home late and the streetlight flared, my feet dragged me past that house like a magnet. I wanted to know what the smear on the back door had been, what the prints in the hall belonged to, what the knock on the window meant. The answer never came. A month after that, the house was gone. Not demolished so much as swallowed squads with chainsaws, the awkward swallowing of wood into trucks. A few neighbors told excited stories about the man who had recently moved away and the family who'd left in a hurry. Someone said the police had been called once, years ago, for a missing person. Someone else said the house was never empty. It had always had someone living in the attic, keeping to themselves. The stories were a quilt of hearsay. What stayed with me was smaller and quieter. A week after the house came down, I found a photograph slid under my apartment door. No envelope, just the single frame-like rectangle of glossy paper with my name on the back written in a hand I didn't know. On the front was a picture of my futon in the corner of my room, taken from the doorway. Someone had stood just outside and snapped a photo of me sleeping. I don't know who took it. I live alone. No one else has keys. I slept with the light on for the next month. I checked the windows. They were intact. I locked the door twice. I told myself the photograph had to be a prank, a neighbor playing at terror. But the next morning, propped on the courier table near the elevators, was another photograph. This one showed the note from the kitchen counter in the abandoned house. Only in the picture the words were different. They read, "We are not alone." I shredded the second photograph and flushed it down the toilet because it felt like the most violent, decisive action I had available. It made no difference. Every time I fell asleep, there was a soft sense of attention, like someone sitting just on the other side of a thin wall, listening. Sometimes, when I woke in the night, there would be the faintest impression on my shoulder, like the print of fingers on skin that had not been there before. There was never a face. There was never an explanation. I moved apartments 6 months later. I left with boxes taped up and a practiced calm. When I gave the landlord back the keys, he smiled politely and said, "Good to see the place getting fixed up." I nodded. I did not tell him about the photographs or the knocks. What could I say? Who will believe the way the ordinary bent until the edges of it cut? Sometimes when I pass an old building or an empty yard, I think about the small things that made me stop, the tap-tap on the window, the prints in the dust, the neat, urgent handwriting on a scrap of paper. They were not dramatic. They were not loud. They were the sort of things people pass by every day without a second thought. But ordinary things become terrifying in the right order. A sound at night that shouldn't be there. A shadow where it can't be, a note folded and placed like a bookmark in a life you never read. I still don't know who was in that house, what the tally marks on the banister meant, or who took the photographs of my sleeping body. I do know this. A house can keep you after it's emptied. A place can keep the weight of feet that walked its length, the faint outline of a face pressed to wood, the careful hand that wrote a warning and then slipped out the back without anyone seeing. The scariest part is not that someone trespassed in my life, it is that whatever did it understood how to leave the smallest, quietest messages, the ones that fit into the margins of your day and wait until you notice. Last week I woke up to the sound of something tapping very softly on my window. It was 4 a.m. The city was a thin band of white beyond the glass. I held my breath and listened. The tap came again, a single careful knock. I turned on the bedside lamp. On the sill, in the dust, were 2 ovals pressed close together. I have stayed up every night since.
This happened to me when I was 19, during the summer before I started college. I had just moved into a small house on the outskirts of town, an old place with creaking floors and a history that locals whispered about but never fully explained. It was the kind of house that felt alive at night, with the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside often making me pause, listening for something I couldn't quite identify. One evening, I decided to stay up late, immersed in a book that had me turning pages faster than I realized. The dim light from my desk lamp cast long shadows across the room, and I could hear the occasional car passing by outside, their headlights briefly illuminating my walls before disappearing down the street. It was a comforting sound, a reminder that life continued beyond my little sanctuary. Around midnight, I set the book down, feeling the weight of sleep tugging at my eyelids. Just as I was about to turn off the light, I heard it, a soft, almost indistinguishable sound. At first, I thought it was the house settling, a common occurrence in an old building like mine. But then, I heard it again. A faint scratching, like fingernails against wood, coming from the back of the house. I paused, my heart racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. The scratching continued intermittently, and with it, the air in the room seemed to grow colder. I got up from my desk, trying to convince myself that checking it out was the rational thing to do. As I walked down the narrow hallway, the floorboards creaked under my weight, each step echoing in the stillness of the night. I reached the kitchen, where the back door led out to a small yard bordered by thick bushes. The scratching hadn't stopped, and now it sounded more desperate. I edged closer to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. Just before I opened it, a thought struck me. What if it was just an animal? A raccoon or something? Still, I felt a nagging doubt. I had heard stories of people breaking into homes, looking for easy targets, and my house was far enough from the main road that I could see it happening.
Swallowing hard, I opened the door slightly and peered out. The yard was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the half-moon overhead. I could see the bushes swaying gently, but there was no sign of anything unusual. The scratching had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. I was about to close the door when I heard it again, a low, deliberate rustle coming from the bushes. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out any shapes. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. There was no response, only the sound of the wind whispering through the leaves. I stepped outside, holding the door ajar just in case I needed to retreat quickly. As I took a few steps forward, the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. Suddenly, the bush rustled again, and I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. "Is someone there?" I called, and this time, a chilling silence answered me. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw a movement, a figure, shadowy and indistinct, darting between the trees at the edge of my yard. I squinted, my heart racing. Was it a person? I couldn't tell. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back towards the house, slamming the door shut and locking it. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, the sound of my heart pounding loud in my ears. I turned off the kitchen light, retreating to the safety of my bedroom, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening intently. The silence of the house felt oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Hours passed, and just as I felt myself drifting off, I was jolted awake by a loud thud, followed by a series of soft footsteps on the creaking floor below. My heart raced again, and I sat up, my mind racing. Someone was in my house. I grabbed my phone, the dim light illuminating my frantic face as I dialed 911, my hands trembling. The operator's voice was calm, but all I could manage was a whisper. "Someone's in my house." I could hear the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, moving from room to room. "Stay quiet and stay on the line," the operator instructed. "Help is on the way." I pressed myself against the wall, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, and I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, the anticipation of what would happen next filling me with dread. Then, just as I thought I might be safe, I heard a soft voice, low and almost soothing, coming from the hallway. "I know you're in there," it said. "You don't have to be scared." A chill ran down my spine. There was something wrong with that voice, something that twisted my stomach in knots. I could barely think straight, my mind racing. Who was this person? Why were they in my house? The operator's voice broke through my thoughts again. "Can you tell me where you are?" "I'm in my bedroom," I whispered, glancing towards the door. The voice continued, almost tauntingly. "Why don't you come out?" "I just want to talk." I felt frozen in place, my body refusing to move. And then, without warning, I heard the unmistakable sound of the doorknob turning. Panic surged, and I pressed myself harder against the wall, praying that whoever it was wouldn't come in. The door creaked open slowly, and I held my breath. The figure stepped into the room, barely illuminated by the sliver of light coming from the hallway. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their presence, heavy and oppressive. "See? It's okay," the voice said, dripping with a sickening sweetness. "I just want to be friends." And then, without any warning, the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, my heart racing as I desperately tried to turn on the flashlight. When the light flickered on, I directed it towards the figure, but they were gone, vanished into the shadows. The operator's voice crackled through the phone. "Are you there? What's happening?" "I don't know. They were here." I stammered, panic rising in my throat. "Stay calm. Help is almost there," the operator reassured me, but I could hear a hint of urgency in their voice now. I waited, every second stretching into an eternity, the darkness pressing in around me. The only sound was my own breathing, ragged and loud. Then, just as I thought I might be safe, I heard a soft whisper right next to my ear. "I'm not done with you yet." The light flickered, and I felt cold fingers brush against my arm. I screamed, the sound piercing through the silence, but it was drowned out by the sudden crash of the front door being kicked in. "Police, show yourself!" A voice shouted from the hallway, and I felt a rush of hope. But as the officers rushed in, searching my room, I could feel the figure's presence lingering in the shadows, watching, waiting. They never found anyone. The officers searched the whole house, but there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a break-in. It was as if the figure had simply vanished into thin air. I felt a deep, unsettling fear take root in my chest as they assured me I was safe now. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to move on, but the memories haunted me. I could still hear that voice, soft and inviting, echoing in my mind. I moved out shortly after, but sometimes late at night I hear that same scratching sound, faint and distant, reminding me that some things can never truly be escaped. And now I wonder, what really happened that night? Was it just my imagination, or was someone really there? The thought lingers, chilling my bones, leaving me with a sense of dread that I can't shake. Because I know deep down that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting for the right moment to return.